There was once a miller who never seemed to have any luck at all. No matter how hard he worked, he always seemed to grow poorer. At last he had nothing except his mill, his wife, and his beautiful daughter, Rose. "If the king thought you were somebody special," said his wife, "he'd come to visit us. Then everyone would want to use our mill, and we'd soon be rich again." "Don't be daft," said the miller. But his wife's words stuck in his mind, and a daring plan came to him. Early next morning, he set off for the palace. At the palace gates, the miller asked to see the king. The king ordered the miller to be brought before him. "Your Majesty, my daughter can spin straw into gold." "She can, can't she?" said the king. "Bring her to the palace and we'll see. If what you say is true, then you'll be richly rewarded." He paused and frowned. "But if she fails, she'll lose her head." This was not at all what the miller had expected. "No, no, I made up the whole story," he cried, but no one would listen. There was nothing left for him to do but go home and tell his daughter what the king had said. Rose was horrified. "But what's done is done," she said. "The king may yet change his mind." And with that, she set out for the palace. When the king saw the lovely Rose, he was surprised at her grace and courage, but all he said was, "So here is our golden fingers. I filled a room with straw for you. Before morning you must spin every scrap into gold, or lose your head." Even the guards felt sorry for Rose as they locked her into the room at the top of the tower. Rose sat down by the spinning wheel, and tears rolled down her cheeks. "If there's one thing I hate, it's crying," said a voice at her elbow. "I beg your pardon," said Rose. "But who are you?" "Never you mind," said the little man. "I know who you are, and it would be a shame for you to lose that pretty little head. I might even help you if you had something to give me in return." Rose felt a sudden hope. "You could have my necklace," she said. "It belonged to my grandmother." "That's not much," said the little man, "but it'll do." He stood at the spinning wheel, and it went round, so fast that all you could see was a blur and the flash of bright straw. Rose felt strangely sleepy as she watched him. All of a sudden, she heard the king opening the tower door. It was morning. Terrified, she leapt to her feet, and the room was full of glittering gold. The king was delighted, but he did not show it. He wanted more gold. "I have filled a second room with straw," he said. "If you spin every scrap into gold before sunrise, your father will have his reward. Otherwise, you will lose your head." Rose wept. This room was twice as big as the last one, but what did that matter? She could not even spin one straw into gold. "Still crying?" said a voice. It was the strange little man. "What will you give me this time to spin your straw into gold?" Rose dried her tears as fast as she could. "My ring," she said. "It was given to me by my mother." Exactly as before, the little man sat down at the spinning wheel, and exactly as before, Rose fell into a deep sleep. By the time the first rays of the morning sun slipped in through the tower window, the room was glistening with spun gold. But still, the king wanted more. "One more night you must spin straw into gold," he said. "If by sunrise not a scrap of straw remains, you shall become my wife. If you fail, you will lose your head." He could not help hoping she would succeed. "Where else would I find a wife richer or more beautiful?" he thought. Rose was locked in the tower for a third night, and the room was 3 times as big as before. Patiently, she waited for the little man. "What will you give me this time?" he asked as soon as he appeared. "I have nothing left to give you," said Rose. "But if you take pity on me now, I'll give you anything you want when I am queen." "Anything, eh? Then you must give me your firstborn child." Poor Rose. What could she do but agree? "Don't forget," warned the little man. "We have made a bargain." The king waited impatiently for the sun to rise. As he opened the door of the tower room, he blinked at the brilliance before him. The room was filled to the rafters with gleaming gold. Soon all the bells in the land were ringing for the new queen, and the miller and his wife cried with joy to see their daughter such a fine lady. Many months passed, and by the time that Rose had a pretty little baby in her arms, she had forgotten all about the little man and her promise to him. But one day, almost a year later, she heard a horribly familiar voice at her elbow. "We have a bargain, my lady," said the little man. "That child is mine." In vain Rose wept and offered him gold and jewels. He grinned, his eyes as cold and bright as a lizard's. "What do I need with gold? But I cannot bear crying. Guess my name, and you can keep your child. I'll give you 3 days and 3 guesses on each day. If you can't, then the baby's mine." Rose quickly sent messengers to ride to every corner of the land in search of names. First they found simple ones like Tom, Dick, Harry, James and John. Then they brought in stranger ones like Wigglebottom and Curly-Toes, Bundlewick and Chumpers. Rosie's heart sank. How could she tell if any belonged to the little man? At the end of the first day, the little man appeared as promised. "My name, lady?" he demanded. "Is it Andrew?" she faltered. "No." "Is it Balthazar?" "No." "Is it Caspar?" she said, almost in tears. "No, and you'll not guess it ever," he crowed. The second night, Rose cried and begged, but the little man seemed to feel no pity. At each wrong guess, his eyes lit up in triumph. "One more night, and the baby is mine," he jeered. The third day came, and Rose shut herself in her room. "One more day," she thought, "and my happiness is gone forever." Out of her window, she could see the king as he set off hunting. When the king came home from hunting that evening, he went in search of his wife. "Rose, my love," he said, "I've just heard the strangest thing. Such a funny, squeaky little song, and you'll never guess who was singing it." "No," said Rose, not lifting her head. "A little man with a long grey beard." "A long grey beard?" cried Rose. "Yes," said the king, glad to see the success of his story. "And he was spinning almost as well as you can. I could hardly see the wheel, it was going so fast. Let me see. Now, what was he singing? 'Nobody knows it except him who chose it, so solemnly swear by the hair on my chin that my name is Rumpelstiltskin.'" Joyfully, the queen kissed her husband. She could hardly wait for the little man to arrive. That evening he appeared as suddenly as ever. "I'll save you the trouble and take the child now," he said gleefully. "You'll not guess my name." "Is it Alfred?" said Rose. "No." "Is it Archibald?" "Certainly not." Then Rose pointed at him, laughing, and began to sing. "Nobody knows it except him who chose it, so solemnly swear by the hair on my chin that my name is Rumpelstiltskin." The little man froze, unable to believe his ears. Then he flew into a towering rage. "Some witch told you that!" he shrieked. "Be off with you," said Rose. "I've kept our bargain." The little man now was in a hideous fury. He stamped his foot so hard that it went through the floor. He struggled to free himself, and his beard became tangled in the splintered wood. At last, with a frightful scream, he vanished, leaving nothing but a few wisps of grey hair behind. That night, Rose smiled happily as she sang her baby to sleep. She knew that as long as she lived, she would never see Rumpelstiltskin again. Once upon a time, in a great castle, a prince's daughter, in spite of a wicked stepmother, grew up happy and contented. She was very pretty, with blue eyes and long black hair. Her skin was delicate and fair, and so she was called Snow White. Everyone was quite sure she would become very beautiful. Though her stepmother was a wicked woman, she too was very beautiful, and the magic mirror told her this every day, whenever she asked it. "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The reply was always, "You are, your majesty," until the dreadful day when she heard it say, "Snow White is the loveliest in the land." The stepmother was furious, and wild with jealousy began plotting to get rid of her rival. Calling one of her trusty servants, she bribed him with a rich reward to take Snow White into the forest far away from the castle. There, unseen, he was to put her to death. The greedy servant, attracted to the reward, agreed to do this deed, and he led the innocent little girl away. However, when they came to the fatal spot, the man's courage failed him, and leaving Snow White sitting beside a tree, he mumbled an excuse and ran off. Snow White was all alone in the forest. Night came, but the servant did not return. Snow White, alone in the dark forest, began to cry bitterly. She thought she could feel terrible eyes on her, and she heard strange sounds and rustlings that made her heart thump. At last, overcome by tiredness, she fell asleep curled up under a tree. Snow White slept fitfully, wakening from time to time with a start and staring into the darkness round her. Several times she thought she felt something or somebody touch her as she slept. At last, dawn broke to the song of the birds, and Snow White too awoke. The whole world was stirring to life, and the little girl was glad to see how silly her fears had been. However, the thick trees were like a wall round her, and as she tried to find her way out, she came upon a path. She walked along it, hopefully. On she walked till she came to a clearing, and there stood a strange cottage with a tiny door, tiny windows, and a tiny chimney pot. Everything about the cottage was much tinier than it ought to be. Snow White pushed the door open. "I wonder who lives here," she said to herself, peeping round the kitchen. "What tiny plates and spoons! There must be 7 of them, the tables laid for 7 people." Upstairs was a bedroom with 7 neat little beds. Going back to the kitchen, Snow White had an idea. "I'll make them something to eat. When they come home, they'll be glad to find a meal ready." Towards dusk, 7 tiny men marched homewards, singing. But when they opened the door, to their surprise, they found a bowl of hot soup steaming on the table. The whole house was spick and span. Upstairs was Snow White, fast asleep on one of the beds. The chief dwarf prodded her gently. "Who are you?" he asked. Snow White told them her sad story, and tears sprung to the dwarf's eyes. Then one of them said, as he noisily blew his nose, "Stay here with us." "Hooray! Hooray!" they cheered, dancing joyfully round the little girl. The dwarf said to Snow White, "You could live here and tend the house while we're down the mine." "Don't worry about your stepmother leaving you in the forest. We love you, and we'll take care of you." Snow White gratefully accepted their hospitality, and next morning the dwarf set off for work. But they warned Snow White not to open the door to strangers. Meanwhile, the servant had returned to the castle with the heart of a roe deer. He gave it to the cruel stepmother, telling her it belonged to Snow White, so that he could claim the reward. But when the mirror next replied, her hopes were dashed. "The loveliest in the land is still Snow White, who lives in the 7 dwarfs' cottage down in the forest." The stepmother was beside herself with rage. "She must die! She must die!" she screamed. Disguising herself as an old peasant woman, she put a poisoned apple with the others in her basket. Then, taking the quickest way into the forest, she rode across the marsh at the edge of the trees. She reached the bank unseen, just as Snow White stood waving goodbye to the 7 dwarfs on their way to the mine. Snow White was in the kitchen when she heard the sound at the door. "Knock, knock." "Who's there?" she called suspiciously, remembering the dwarf's advice. "I'm an old peasant woman selling apples," came the reply. "I don't need any apples, thank you," she replied. "But they are beautiful apples and ever so juicy," said the velvety voice from outside the door. "I'm not supposed to open the door to anyone," said the little girl, who was reluctant to disobey her friends. "And quite right, too. Good girl. If you promise not to open up to strangers, then you can't buy. You are a good girl indeed." Then the old woman went on. "And as a reward for being good, I'm going to make you a gift of one of my apples." Without a further thought, Snow White opened the door just a tiny crack to take the apple. "There. Now isn't that a nice apple?" Snow White bit into the fruit, and as she did, fell to the ground in a faint. The effect of the terrible poison left her lifeless immediately. Now, chuckling evilly, the wicked stepmother hurried off, while Snow White turned white as a sheet with the paleness of death. One of the rabbits who had witnessed the scene ran with the other animals to tell the dwarfs. "Come quickly! Snow White is dead!" The dwarfs rushed breathlessly to the cottage. "What happened?" they gasped in despair. An old woman knocked at the door and... The 7 dwarfs did their best to bring Snow White round, but still she lay white and lifeless. The angry dwarfs asked the animals which way the wicked stepmother had gone. They had almost caught up with her, when a sudden flash of lightning ripped the sky. It struck the crag where the wicked stepmother was standing, and she toppled over the precipice. Now that the wicked stepmother was dead, the dwarfs went back to the cottage. They wept for a long time over Snow White, and laid her on a bed of rose petals. Then they carried her in the forest and put her into a crystal coffin. Each day they laid a flower there. Then, one evening, they discovered a strange young man admiring Snow White's lovely face through the glass. After listening to the story, the prince, for he was a prince, made a suggestion. If you allow me to take her to the castle, I'll call in famous doctors to wake her from this peculiar sleep. She's so lovely. I'd love to kiss her. So he did, and magically, the prince's kiss broke the spell. To everyone's astonishment, Snow White opened her eyes. She had amazingly come back to life. Now, head over heels in love, the prince asked Snow White to marry him. And the dwarfs had to reluctantly say goodbye to Snow White. From that day on, Snow White lived happily in a great castle. But from time to time, she was drawn back to visit the little cottage in the forest. Once upon a time, in a splendid palace on the bed of the bluest ocean, lived the Sea King, a wise old Triton with a long flowing white beard. He lived in a magnificent palace built of gaily coloured coral seashells, together with his 5 daughters, very beautiful mermaids. Sirenetta, the youngest and loveliest of them all, also had a beautiful voice, and when she sang, the fishes flocked from all over the sea to listen. The young mermaid often sang, and each time she would gaze upwards, seeking the faint sunlight that scarcely managed to filter down into the depths. Oh, how I'd love to go up there and at last see the sky, which everyone says is so pretty, and hear the voices of humans and smell the scent of the flowers. You're still too young, said her mother. In a year or 2, when you're 15, only then will the king let you go up there like your sisters. As she waited for the day when she would be allowed to reach the surface of the sea and meet the unknown world, Sirenetta spent her time in her wonderful sea garden. The seahorses kept her company, and sometimes a dolphin would come and play. Only the unfriendly starfish never replied when she called. At last, her long-desired birthday came. The night before, Sirenetta could not sleep a wink. In the morning, her father called her, and stroking her long golden hair, slipped a lovely carved flower into her locks. There. Now you can go to the surface. You'll breathe air and see the sky, but remember, it's not our world. We can only watch it and admire. We're children of the sea, and we have no soul as men do. Be careful and keep away from them. They can only bring bad luck. In a second, Sirenetta had kissed her father and was darting smoothly towards the surface of the sea. She swam so fast with flicks of her slender tail that even the fish could not keep up with her. Suddenly, she popped out of the water. How wonderful! For the first time, she saw the great blue sky, and as dusk began to fall, the first stars were peeping out and twinkling. So lovely, she exclaimed happily. But another nice surprise was in store for her. A ship was slowly sailing towards the rock on which Sirenetta was sitting. The sailors dropped anchor, and the ship swayed gently in the calm sea. Sirenetta watched the men go about their work aboard, lighting the lanterns for the night. She could clearly hear their voices. I'd love to speak to them, she said to herself. But then she gazed down at her long, flexible tail, her equivalent of legs, and said to herself, I can never be like them. Aboard ship, a strange excitement seemed to seize the crew, and a little later, the sky became a spray of many-coloured lights, and a crackle of fireworks filled the sky. Long live the captain! Hooray for his 20th birthday! Hooray! Hooray! Many happy returns! Astonished at all this, the little mermaid caught sight of the young man in whose honour the display was being held. Tall and dignified, he was smiling happily, and Sirenetta could not take her eyes from him. She followed his every movement, fascinated by all that was happening. The party went on, but the sea grew more agitated. Sirenetta anxiously realized that the men were now in danger. An icy wind was sweeping the waves. The ink-black sky was torn by flashes of lightning. Then a terrible storm broke suddenly over the helpless ship. In vain Sirenetta screamed, "Look out! Beware of the sea!" But the howling wind carried her words away, and the rising waves swept over the ship. By the light of one of the lamps, Sirenetta had seen the young captain fall into the water, and she swam to his rescue. But she couldn't find him in the high waves, and tired out, was about to give up when suddenly there he was, on the crest of a nearby wave. In an instant, he was swept straight into the mermaid's arms. The young man was unconscious, and the mermaid held his head above the water in the stormy sea in an effort to save his life. She clung to him for hours, trying to fight the tiredness that was overtaking her. Then, as suddenly as it had sprung up, the storm died away. In a grey dawn over a still, angry sea, Sirenetta realized thankfully that land lay ahead. Aided by the motion of the waves, she pushed the captain's body onto the shore beyond the water's edge. Unable herself to walk, the mermaid sat wringing her hands, her tail lapped by the rippling water, trying to warm the young captain with her own body. Then, the sound of approaching voices startled Sirenetta, and she slipped back into the deeper water. "Come quickly, quickly!" came a woman's voice in alarm. "There's a man here. Look, I think he's unconscious." The captain was now in good hands. "Let's take him out to the castle." No, better get help." And the first thing the young man saw when he opened his eyes again was the beautiful face of the youngest of the group of 3 ladies. Thank you for saving my life," he murmured to the lovely unknown lady. From the sea, Sirenetta watched the man she had snatched from the waves turn towards the castle, without knowing that a mermaid had saved his life. Slowly swimming out to sea, Sirenetta felt that there on the beach she had left behind something she could never bring herself to forget. How wonderful those tremendous hours in the storm had been, as she had battled with the elements. And as she swam down towards her father's palace, her sisters came to meet her, anxious to know what had kept her for so long on the surface. Sirenetta began to tell her story, but suddenly a lump came to her throat, and bursting into tears, she fled to her room. She stayed there for a day, refusing to see anyone or to touch food. She knew that her love for the young captain was without hope, for she was a mermaid and could never marry a human. Only the Witch of the Deeps could help her. But what price would she have to pay? Sirenetta decided to ask the witch. "So you want to get rid of your fishy tail, do you? I expect you'd like to have a pair of women's legs, isn't that so?" said the nasty witch scornfully from her cave guarded by a giant squid. "Be warned," she went on. "You will suffer horribly, as though a sword were cutting you apart, and every time you place your feet on the earth, you will feel dreadful pain." "It doesn't matter, as long as I can go back to him." "All right." The witch had told Sirenetta that the young captain was actually a prince, and the mermaid left the water at a spot not far from the castle. She pulled herself onto the beach, then drank the magic potion. An agonizing pain made her faint, and when she came to her senses, she could mistily see the face she loved smiling down at her. The witch's magic had worked the spell, for the prince had felt a strange desire to go down to the beach just as Sirenetta was arriving. There he had stumbled on her, and recalling how he too had once been washed up on the shore, gently laid his cloak over the still body cast up by the waves. "Don't be frightened," he said quickly. "You're quite safe. Where have you come from?" But Sirenetta was now dumb and could not reply. "I'll take you to the castle and look after you," he said. In the days that followed, the mermaid started a new life. She wore splendid dresses and often went out on horseback with the prince. One evening, she was invited to a great ball at court. However, as the witch had foretold, every movement and each step she took was torture. Sirenetta bravely put up with her suffering, glad to be allowed to stay near her beloved prince. And though she could not speak to him, he was fond of her and showered kindness on her to her great joy. However, the young man's heart really belonged to the unknown lady he had seen as he lay on the shore, though he had never met her since, for she had returned at once to her own land. Even when he was in the company of Sirenetta, fond of her though he was, the unknown lady was always in his thoughts. And the little mermaid, guessing instinctively that she was not his true love, suffered even more. She often crept out of the castle at night to weep by the seashore. Once she thought she could spy her sisters rise from the water and wave at her, but this made her feel sadder than ever. Fate, however, had another surprise in store. From the castle ramparts one day, a huge ship was sighted sailing into the harbour. Together with Sirenetta, the prince went down to meet it. And who stepped from the vessel but the unknown lady who had been for so long in the prince's heart? When he saw her, he rushed to greet her. Sirenetta felt herself turn to stone, and a painful feeling pierced her heart. She was about to lose the prince forever. The unknown lady, too, had never forgotten the young man she had found on the beach. And soon after, he asked her to marry him. Since she too was in love, she happily said yes. A few days after the wedding, the happy couple were invited to go for a voyage on the huge ship, which was still in the harbour. Sirenetta too went on board, and the ship set sail. Night fell, and sick at heart over the loss of the prince, Sirenetta went on deck. She remembered the witch's prophecy, and was now ready to give up her life and dissolve in the sea. Suddenly she heard a cry from the water, and dimly saw her sisters in the darkness. "Sirenetta! Sirenetta! It's us, your sisters! We've heard all about what happened. Look, do you see this knife? It's magic. Take it. Kill the prince before dawn, and you will become a mermaid again, and forget all your trouble." As though in a trance, Sirenetta clasped the knife and entered the cabin where the prince and his bride lay sleeping. But as she gazed down at the young man's sleeping face, she simply blew him a furtive kiss before running back on deck. As dawn broke, she threw the knife into the sea. Then she shot a parting glance at the world she was leaving and dived into the waves, ready to turn into the foam of the sea from whence she had come and vanish. As the sun rose over the horizon, it cast a long golden ray of light across the sea, and in the chilly water, Sirenetta turned towards it for the last time. Suddenly, as though by magic, a mysterious force drew her out of the water, and she felt herself lifted high into the sky. The clouds were tinged with pink, the sea rippled in the early morning breeze, and the little mermaid heard a whisper through the tinkling of bells. "Sirenetta! Sirenetta! Come with us!" "Who are you?" asked the mermaid, surprised to find she had recovered the use of her voice. "Where am I?" "You're with us, in the sky. We're the fairies of the air. We have no soul as men do, but our task is to help them. We take amongst us only those who have shown kindness to men." Greatly touched, Sirenetta looked down over the sea towards the prince's ship and felt tears spring to her eyes. The fairies of the air whispered to her, "Look, the earth flowers are waiting for our tears to turn into the morning dew. Come along with us." Once upon a time, there was a woman who dearly wanted a baby child, only she had no idea where to get one from. So going to an old witch, she said to her, "I'd love to have a baby child. Do tell me where to get one."
"Why, that's easily arranged," said the witch. "You see this barley corn? It's different from the ones that grow in the farmer's field or that the poultry are fed on. Now, put that in a plant pot and see what happens."
"Thank you," said the woman. Soon there grew up a lovely big flower. It looked exactly like a tulip, only the petals were shut up, as though it was still in bud. "There's a pretty flower," said the woman. She kissed its beautiful red and yellow petals, but the moment she kissed it, it gave a loud and opened. Now, it was a real tulip, you could see that. But sitting on the green pistil in the centre of the flower was a tiny girl. Such a pretty little thing. And she wasn't any bigger than your thumb. So they called her Thumbelina. A nicely varnished walnut shell made a cradle for her. Blue-violet petals were her mattress, and her counterpane was a rose petal. She lay in her pretty little bed one night when there came jumping in at the window through a broken pane an ugly toad. It was such a horrid toad, big and wet. It jumped right onto the table where Thumbelina lay fast asleep beneath the red rose petal.
"Rabbit, she'd make my son a lovely wife,"
said the toad. And picking up the walnut shell with Thumbelina asleep inside it, she hopped away through the window and into the garden. A big wide stream flowed through the garden. The edge of this was all swampy and muddy, and here lived the toad with her son. Ugh! He too was ugly, just like his mother.
Right. Rabbit, rabbit, don't talk so loud, Rab, or she'll wake up, said the old toad. She'll run away from us yet. She's as light as swan's down. Rab. We'll put her out on the stream, on one of those broad water lily leaves. Light and tiny as she is, it'll make an island for her. She won't be able to run away from there, and meanwhile, we'll get ready the front room under the mud where you'll be making your home. Rab.
Growing in the middle of the stream were many water lilies, with those broad green leaves which seemed to float on the water. The leaf farthest out happened also to be the biggest. And swimming out to this, the old toad placed the walnut shell with Thumbelina in it and left her there. The poor little thing woke up very early in the next morning, and seeing where she was, she cried her little eyes out. All round the big green leaf there was nothing but water, and to get ashore was quite impossible. Down below the mud, the old toad decorated her room with rushes and yellow water lily buds, and when she'd finished, she swam with her horrid son to the leaf where they'd left Thumbelina.
Rab, here's my son. He's going to be your husband, and you'll have a lovely home under the mud. Rab, rab, rabbit.
That was all her son could say, and then they took the pretty little bed and swam away with it, leaving Thumbelina crying on the green leaf all by herself. The little fishes that were swimming about in the water must have seen the toad and heard what she said, because they popped up their heads and crowded round the green stalk that held the leaf on which she stood. They nibbled at it with their teeth, and the leaf floated off downstream, carrying Thumbelina far away, right out of the toad's reach. Thumbelina went sailing on past all sorts of places. Her leaf floated farther and farther away, and so it came about that Thumbelina went abroad. Fluttering round her was a lovely little white butterfly, and in the end it settled on her leaf. Taking her sash, she tied one end to the butterfly and the other to the leaf, and the leaf floated along faster than ever, she standing on it and floating with it. All of a sudden, a big beetle flew up and, catching sight of her, at once fastened its claw round her slender waist and flew off with her into a tree. Settling with her on the biggest green leaf in the tree, it fed her on the honey of flowers and said how pretty she was, though not at all like a beetle. Before long, all the other beetles that lived in the tree called round to see them. They looked at Thumbelina, and then, shrugging their feelers, the young lady beetle said, "Why, she's only got 2 legs. Doesn't she look a fright?" And they said, "She hasn't got any feelers. Isn't she thin around the waist? Ugh, she looks almost human. Ugh, isn't she ugly?" And all the time, Thumbelina was so pretty. So thought the beetle who had carried her off. But when all the others said she was ugly, he came round to the same idea and would have nothing more to do with her, saying she could go if she liked. And so, flying down from the tree with her, they left her on a daisy, crying to herself. All that summer, Thumbelina lived by herself in the big wood. And so summer and autumn passed and were followed by winter, the long, cold winter. When it began to snow, she wrapped herself in a dead leaf, but it didn't warm her. She was shivering cold. Just outside the big wood where she'd been taken, there was a large cornfield, but the corn had long since gone, and only the bare, dry stubble stood up from the frozen ground. To her, walking through this was like walking through a forest. Oh, how she shivered with cold. In time, she had reached the door of the field mouse. It was a little hole under the stubble. There the field mouse lived, snug and warm, with a room full of corn and a lovely kitchen and larder. "You poor little thing," said the field mouse. "Come into my warm parlour and have a meal with me. If you wish, you can stay with me for the winter, if you'll keep my parlour nice and clean and tell me stories. I'm so fond of stories." So Thumbelina did as the good old field mouse asked her to, and felt very much at home. "We'll be having a visitor before long," said the field mouse. "My neighbour calls on me every weekday. He's even better off than I am. He has a big hall to live in and wears the loveliest black coat. Now, if you could marry him, you'd be well provided for, though he can't see. You'll have to tell him all your nicer stories." But Thumbelina didn't care for the idea. She didn't want to marry the neighbour. He was a mole, you see. He came round in his black velvet coat. He was so very rich and such a good scholar, said the field mouse. And sure enough, his house was over 20 times as big as the field mouse's, and there was no doubt about his being a scholar. But the sun and the beautiful flowers meant nothing to him at all. And never having seen them, he could get quite spiteful about them. Thumbelina had to sing, and she sang both Ladybird, Ladybird, Fly Away Home and Ring a Ring a Roses, till the mole fell in love with her beautiful voice. But he never said a word. He was such a thinking man. He had lately dug himself a long passage under the ground leading from his house to theirs, and here the field mouse and Thumbelina were allowed to walk whenever they liked. He told them not to be afraid of the dead bird which lay there in the passage. There on the floor lay a dead swallow, its beautiful wings pressed tightly to its sides and its legs and head drawn up under its feathers. The poor bird must surely have died of cold. Thumbelina felt so very sorry for it, for she was so fond of all the little birds, and they all sung and twittered so beautifully for her all through the summer. But the mole only kicked it with his stubbly legs and said, "That'll chirp no more. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird. Thank goodness none of my children ever will be."
"A man of sense like you may well say that," said the field mouse. "What has a bird to show for its twittering when winter comes? It's bound to starve to death."
Thumbelina kept quiet. But when the others had turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down, brushed the feathers from its head, and kissed its closed eyes. "Perhaps this is the one which sang so sweetly for me last summer," she thought. "What pleasure it gave me, the dear sweet bird." The mole stopped up the hole through which the daylight had shone, and then saw the ladies home. But that night, Thumbelina just couldn't sleep, and getting out of bed, she took some hay and wove from it a fine big blanket, which she spread over the dead bird, putting soft cotton wool that she had found in the field mouse's parlour along its sides to keep it warm in the cold ground. "Goodbye, you pretty little bird," she said. "Goodbye, and thank you for your lovely singing last summer when the trees were green and the sun shone so warmly down on us." She said this as she put her head to the bird's breast, and she got such a start, for inside it something seemed to be throbbing. It was the bird's heart. It wasn't dead. It had been in a swoon, and being warmed up had revived it. Thumbelina trembled all over. She was so frightened, for the bird was so very, very big alongside her, who was no taller than your thumb. But plucking up courage, she tucked up the cotton wool round the poor swallow. She crept down to it the next night, and there it was, quite alive, only so faint that it could just open its eyes for a moment and see Thumbelina as she stood there with a piece of touchwood in her hand, the only lantern she had. "Thank you, pretty little child," the sick swallow said to her. "I've been so nicely warmed up. I shall soon get back to my strength, and then I'll be able to fly again away into the warm sunshine." "Oh," she said, "it's so cold outside. It's snowing and freezing. Stay in your warm bed, and I'll take care of you." Now, all through the winter, it stayed down below, and Thumbelina was kind to it, and very, very fond of it. As soon as spring came round, and the sun had warmed up the earth, the swallow said goodbye to Thumbelina, and she opened up the hole in the roof the way the mole had done. The sun shone beautifully in on them, and the swallow asked her if she wouldn't like to come too. She could sit on his back, he said, and they would fly away into the green wood. But Thumbelina knew that the old field mouse would be sorry if she left her like that. "No, I can't come," said Thumbelina. "Goodbye. Goodbye, you darling little girl," said the swallow, and off it flew into the sunshine. Thumbelina watched it go, and tears came into her eyes. She was so very, very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird as it flew off into the green wood. Thumbelina was so sad. She was never allowed out into the warm sunshine. "Now, during the summer, you must begin making your trousseau," the field mouse said to her. For now her neighbour, the tiresome mole in the black velvet coat, had proposed to her. "You'll want both woolens and linens. You'll need things to sit on and things to lie on when you marry the mole." Yes, when the summer was over, his wedding with Thumbelina would take place. But she wasn't the least bit happy, for she didn't like the tiresome old mole at all. Now, when autumn came round, Thumbelina had quite finished her trousseau. "Now it'll be your wedding day," the field mouse said to her. But Thumbelina only cried and said that she wouldn't have the tiresome mole. "Fiddlesticks," said the field mouse. And so the wedding day came round. The mole had already come to fetch Thumbelina, for she was to live with him under the ground, deep into the earth, and never come out into the warm sunshine again. The poor child was so sad at having to say goodbye to the beautiful sunshine, which at the field mouse's house she had at least been able to look at in the doorway. "Goodbye, bright sunshine. Goodbye. Goodbye,"
she said, flinging her tiny arms round the little red flower that was growing there. "Give my love to the dear swallow if you should see him." Tweet, tweet, sounded from above her head as she spoke. She looked up, and there, just passing her, was the swallow. It was so very delighted when it saw Thumbelina, and she told it how much he hated the idea of having the horrid mole for a husband and living down deep under the earth where the sun never shone. The very thought of it made her cry. "The cold winter is coming now," said the swallow. "I shall be flying far away to the warm countries. Will you come with me? You can sit on my back. Fly off with me, dear sweet little Thumbelina, who saved my life when I lay freezing cold in the dark under the ground." "Very well, I'll come with you," said Thumbelina. And sitting up on the bird's back, with her feet on its outstretched wings, she tied her belt fast to one of the strongest feathers, and then the swallow flew high into the air, over the wood and over the sea, high up over the great mountains where the snow always lies. And Thumbelina shivered in the cold air. But then she snuggled under the bird's warm feathers, just putting out her little head to see all the loveliness that lay beneath. And so they came to the warm countries. "Here is my house," said the swallow. "But if you choose for yourself one of the most beautiful of the flowers growing down there, I'll put you off on it, and you'll be as happy as ever you could wish for." "Oh, how lovely!" she cried, clapping her little hands. Living on the ground was a big white marble pillar which had fallen down and broken into 3 pieces, and between these were the prettiest big white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and put her off on one of the broad petals. And what a surprise she got then! Sitting in the middle of the flower was a little man, as white and transparent as though he'd been made out of glass. On his head, the loveliest clear golden crown, and on his shoulders, the loveliest clear wings. He himself was no bigger than Thumbelina. He was the flower's angel. A little man or woman, like him, lived in every flower, but this one was king over them all. "I say, isn't he handsome?" Thumbelina whispered to the swallow. The little prince was quite frightened of the swallow, for of course it was a real giant of a bird compared to him, who was so tiny and small. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was so glad. She was the very prettiest girl he had ever seen, and so he took his crown off his head, and putting it onto her head, asked her name and if she would be his wife, when she would be queen of all the flowers. Well, here was a husband indeed, a very different one from the toad's son and the mole with the black velvet coat. So she said yes to the lovely prince, and from every flower came a lady or a gentleman, so charming it was delightful to see. Each brought Thumbelina a present, but the best of them all was a pair of pretty wings from a big white insect. They were fastened to Thumbelina's back, and then she too could fly from flower to flower. There was such rejoicing, and the swallow sat up in its nest and sang to them for all it was worth. There was once a merchant who was very rich. He had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, and as he was a man of good sense, his daughters were all beautiful. But his youngest one was especially admired, and from the time she was a small child had been only known and spoken of as Beauty. The name remained with her as she grew older, which gave rise to a great deal of jealousy on the part of her sisters. Then, all at once, the merchant lost the whole of his fortune. Nothing was left to him but a little house situated far away in the country. He told his children that they would have to go and live there, and that even they would have to support themselves by the work of their own hands. As soon as they were settled in, the merchant and his sons began to till the ground. Beauty rose every morning at 4 o'clock, and she found her duties painful and fatiguing at first, for she had not been accustomed to such work, but in 2 months' time she had grown stronger, and the activity of their life gave her fresh health and colour. Meanwhile, her 2 sisters were bored to death with the dullness of their life. They stayed in bed till 10 o'clock, did nothing all day but saunter about, and for their only diversion talked with regret of their former fine clothes and friends. The family had lived in this solitude for a year, when the merchant heard that a vessel on which there was merchandise belonging to him had arrived safely in port. The 2 elder sisters were nearly out of their minds with joy when they heard the good news. They begged their father, when he departed, to bring them back dresses and capes, headdresses, and all sorts of goods and ends and fancy attire. Beauty asked for nothing.
"Is there nothing you wish me to buy for you?" said her father. "As you are so kind to me," she replied, "I pray you to bring me a rose." The father left them. But on arriving at his destination, he had to go to law about his merchandise, and after a great deal of trouble, he turned back home as poor as he came. He had not many more miles to go, and was already enjoying in anticipation the pleasure of seeing his children again. When passing on his journey through a large wood, he lost his way. It was snowing hard, the wind was violent, and night was closing in. All at once, however, he caught sight of a bright light. He walked towards it, and soon saw that it came from a splendid castle, which was brilliantly illuminated. The merchant thanked God for the help that had been sent him, and hastened towards the castle, but was greatly surprised on reaching it to find no one in the courtyard or about the entrances. His horse, which was following him, seeing the door of a large stable standing open, went in, and finding there some hay and oats, began eating. The merchant fastened him up in the stable and went towards the house, found a good fire and a table laid for one person, covered with provisions. Being wet to the skin with the rain and snow, he drew near the fire to dry himself, saying as he did so, "The master of this house or his servants will pardon me the liberty I am taking. No doubt they will soon appear." He waited for a considerable time, but when 11 o'clock had struck, and still he had seen no one, he could no longer resist the feeling of hunger, and seizing some chicken, he ate it, though trembling all the while. Then he took a draught or two of wine, and his courage returning, left the dining hall and made his way through several large rooms, all magnificently furnished. Finally, he came to a room where there was a comfortable bed, and as it was past midnight, and he was very tired, he made up his mind to lock the door and lie down. It was 10 o'clock next morning before he awoke, when, to his great surprise, he found new clothes put in place of his own, which had been completely spoiled anyway. "This place must certainly belong to some god-fairy," he said to himself, "who, seeing my condition, has taken pity on me." He looked out of the windows. The snow was gone, and he saw instead grass and flowers, which were a delight to the eye. He went again into the dining hall where he had supped the night before, and saw a little table with chocolate upon it. "I thank you, good fairy," he said aloud, "for your kindness in thinking of me and my breakfast." The merchant then went out to find his horse. As he passed under a bower of roses, he remembered that Beauty had asked him to bring her one, and he plucked a branch on which several were growing. He had scarcely done so when he heard a loud roar, and saw coming towards him a beast of such a horrible aspect that he nearly fainted. "You are ungrateful," said the beast in a terrible voice. "I received you into my castle and saved your life, and now you steal my roses, which I care for more than anything else in the world." The merchant threw himself on his knees and, with clasped hands, said to the beast, "Look, I pray you, my lord, to forgive me. I didn't think to offend you by picking a spray of roses for one of my daughters." "I am not called my lord," responded the monster, "but simply the beast. I do not care for compliments, so do not think to mollify me with your flattery. But you tell me you have some daughters. I will pardon you on condition that one of your daughters will come of her own free will to die in your place. Do not stop to argue with me. Go. And if your daughter refuses to die for you, swear that you will return yourself in 3 months' time." The merchant had no intention of sacrificing one of his daughters to this hideous monster, but he thought, "At least I shall have the pleasure of embracing them once more." He swore, therefore, to return, and the beast told him that he might go when he liked. "But," added he, "I do not wish you to go from me with empty hands. Go back to the room in which you slept. There you will find a large empty trunk. You may fill it with whatever you please, and I will have it conveyed to your house." With these words the beast withdrew, and the merchant said to himself, "If I must die, I shall at least have the consolation of leaving my children enough for their daily bread." He returned to the room where he had passed the night, and finding there a great quantity of gold pieces, he filled his trunk, of which the beast had spoken, closed it, and remounting his horse, which he found still in the stable, he rode out from the castle. His sadness now as great as had been his joy on entering it. His horse carried him of his own accord along one of the roads through the forest, and in a few hours the merchant was again in his own little house. His children gathered round him, but instead of finding pleasure in their caresses, he began to weep as he looked upon them. He held in his hand the branch of roses which he had brought for Beauty. "Take them," he said as he gave them to her. "Your unhappy father has paid dearly for them." And then he told his family of the melancholy adventure that had befallen him. Two elder girls, when they had heard his tale, cried and screamed and began saying all sorts of cruel things to Beauty, who did not shed a tear. The merchant was so taken up with grief that he quite forgot about the trunk which he had filled with gold pieces. But to his astonishment, he had no sooner shut himself into his room for the night when he found it beside his bed. He resolved not to tell his children of his newly obtained riches, for he knew that his daughters would then wish to return to the town, and he had made up his mind to die where he was in the country. He confided his secret, however, to Beauty, who told him that there had been visitors at the house during his absence, among them 2 suitors for her sisters. She begged her father to equip them handsomely and allow them to marry, for she was so good of heart that she loved them and freely forgave them all the unkindness they had shown her. The 2 hard-hearted girls rubbed their eyes with an onion that they might shed tears on the departure of their father and Beauty. But the brothers wept sincerely, as also did the merchant. Beauty alone would not cry, fearing that it might increase their sorrow. The horse took the road that led to the castle, which as evening fell came into view, illuminated as before. Again the horse was the only one in the stable, and the merchant entered the large dining hall, this time with his daughter, and there they found the table magnificently laid for 2. The merchant had not the heart to eat, but Beauty, doing her utmost to appear cheerful, sat down to the table and served him something. Then she said to herself, "The beast wants to fatten me before he eats me, since he provides such good cheer." They had hardly finished their supper when the beast appeared. Beauty could not help shuddering when she saw the dreadful shape, but she did her best not to give way to her fear, and when the beast asked her if it was her own free will that she had come, she told him, trembling, that it was so. "You are very good, and I am much obliged to you," said the beast. "Good man, tomorrow morning you will leave, and do not venture ever to come here again." The beast then retired. "Alas, my daughter," said the merchant, "listen to me. You must return home and leave me here." "No, my father," said Beauty without faltering. "You will depart tomorrow morning, and you will leave me under heaven's protection. Maybe I shall find pity and help." They retired to rest, thinking that they would have no sleep at all. But no sooner were they in bed than their eyes closed. In her dreams there appeared to Beauty a lady who said to her, "Beauty, your good action in giving your life to save that of your father will not be without its reward." Beauty told her father next morning of her dream, and although it afforded him some consolation, did not prevent his loud cries of grief when at last he was forced to bid goodbye to his daughter. After his departure, Beauty went back and sat down in the dining hall and began weeping herself. But she was of a courageous disposition, and resolved not to be miserable during the short time still left her to live, for she was quite certain that she was going to die. In the meanwhile, she resolved to walk about and look over the fine castle she was in. What most attracted her admiration was a large bookcase, a piano, and several books of music. "He does not wish me to feel dull," she said in a low voice. Then the thought came to her, "If I was only going to live here a day, there would not be so much provided for my amusement." This thought revived her courage. She opened the bookcase, and there saw a book on which was written in letters of gold, "Wish what you like, command what you will, you alone are queen and mistress here." "Alas," she murmured, sighing, "I wish for nothing but to see my dear father again, and to know what he's doing at this very moment." She had only said this to herself in a low voice. What was her surprise, therefore, when turning towards a large mirror, she saw her home, and her father just returning, and her sisters going forward to meet him. In another minute, the picture had disappeared, and Beauty could not help thinking that the beast was very kind-hearted, and that she had not much to fear from him. In the evening, as she was just sitting down to her meal, she heard the sound of the beast's voice, and could not help shuddering. "Beauty," said the monster to her, "will you allow me to look on while you are eating your supper?" "You are master here," replied Beauty, trembling. "Not so," rejoined the beast. "You alone are mistress. If I annoy you, you have only to tell me to go, and I will leave you at once. But confess now, you think me very ugly, do you not?"
This is true, said Beauty, for I cannot tell a lie, but I think you are very kind.
Will you be my wife?
She sat for a while without answering. She was alarmed at the thought of arousing the monster's anger by refusing him. Nevertheless, she finally said, trembling, "No, beast." At this, the poor monster sighed, and the hideous sound he made echoed throughout the castle. But Beauty was soon reassured, for the beast, after sadly bidding her adieu, left the room. Beauty spent 3 months in the castle, more or less happily. The beast paid her a visit every evening, and conversed with her as she ate her supper. Every day she discovered some fresh good quality in him. She grew accustomed to his ugliness, and far from fearing his visit, she would frequently look at the clock to see if it was nearly 9 o'clock, for the beast always arrived punctually at that hour. There was only one thing which caused her distress, and that was that every evening before retiring, he asked her if she would be his wife, and always appeared overcome with sorrow at her refusal. Then one day, Beauty saw in her mirror that her father was very ill through grief at losing her. And when the beast came, she said to him, "Dear beast, I do so long to visit my father. I shall die of sorrow if you refuse to let me go to see him."
I would rather die myself, said the monster, than give you pain. I will send you home to your father. You will stay there, and your poor beast will die of grief at your absence.
"No, no," said Beauty. "I care for you too much to cause your death. I promise to return in a week's time. My sisters are married, and my brothers have entered the army. My father is alone and ill. Let me remain with him for 1 week.
You shall be with him tomorrow morning. But remember your promise. When you wish to return, you have only to put your ring on the table before going to bed. Farewell, Beauty."
When she awoke the following morning, she found herself at home. And ringing a little bell that stood beside her bed, the maidservant came in, who gave a loud cry of astonishment at seeing her there. Her father ran in on hearing the cry, and almost died of joy when he found his daughter. Beauty, after the first moments of joy were over, remembered that she had brought no clothes with her. But the servant told her that she had just found a trunk in the next room, in which there were dresses of gold fabric trimmed with diamonds. Beauty chose the plainest of these and dressed herself, feeling grateful to the beast for his thoughtfulness. Meanwhile, news of her arrival was sent to her sisters, and they came in haste with their husbands. They nearly died of envy when they saw Beauty dressed like a princess and beautiful as the day. "Why should this wretched little thing be happier than we are? Are we not more attractive than she is?" "Sister," said the eldest one, "an idea has occurred to me. Let us try to keep her here over the week. Her stupid old beast will be enraged at her breaking her word, and perhaps he will debar her." "Ah, you're right, sister," replied the other. "To carry out our plan, we must appear very loving and kind to her." And having settled this, they went back to the house and were so affectionate to her that Beauty cried for joy. When the week drew to a close, the two sisters showed such signs of grief at her departure, and made such lamentation, that she promised to stay till the end of the second one. Beauty, however, reproached herself for the sorrow she would cause her poor beast, whom she had begun to miss very much. On the 10th night of her absence, she dreamt that she was in the garden of the castle, and that she saw the beast lying on the grass, apparently dying. Beauty awoke with a start. "I am indeed wicked," she said, "to behave so ungratefully to a beast who has been so considerate and kind to me." With these words, Beauty placed her ring on the table, lay down again, and fell asleep. When she awoke next morning, she saw with delight that she was back in the beast's castle. She dressed herself magnificently in order to please him, and the hours seemed to drag as she waited for 9 o'clock to strike. But the hour came, and the beast did not appear. Then Beauty began to fear that she had caused his death. She ran through the castle, uttering loud cries, for she was in despair. After having looked everywhere, she remembered her dream and ran into the garden towards the water, where she had seen him in her sleep. She found the poor beast stretched out on the ground and unconscious, and she thought he was dead. Beast opened his eyes and said to Beauty,
"You forgot your promise. In my grief at loving you, I determined to let myself die of hunger. But I die happy since I have had the joy of seeing you once again."
"No, my dear beast, you shall not die," exclaimed Beauty. "You shall live to be my husband. I am yours from this moment, and only yours." Beauty had scarcely uttered these words before she saw the castle suddenly become illuminated, brilliantly, whilst everything indicated the celebration of some joyful event. She didn't gaze long, however, at these splendours, but quickly turned her eyes again towards her dear beast, the thought of whose danger made her tremble with anxiety. But what was her surprise when she saw that the beast had disappeared and that a young and handsome prince was kneeling at her feet. Although this prince was fully worthy of her attention, Beauty, nevertheless, could not help asking what had become of the beast. "You see him at your feet," said the prince. "A wicked fairy condemned me to remain in the form of a monster until some fair damsel would consent to marry me." Beauty, agreeably surprised, gave the young prince her hand to help him to rise. They passed side by side into the castle, and Beauty was overcome with joy when she found her father and all her family assembled in the dining hall. The prince soon married Beauty, and they lived happily ever after.